I was struck by what a bright and beautiful girl she was. She once said, "To tell you the truth, I had an assignment to interview Albert Schweitzer, and I skipped it and went out with you. So I had to marry her." There was a time when a single face could define what dignity looked like, and for many, that face belonged to Gregory Peck. He stood for something rare: quiet strength, measured words, and a kind of integrity that never needed to announce itself. On screen, he was unforgettable, but off-screen, he was far more complex. Behind that calm presence and steady voice was a man who loved more than once, deeply, differently, and often quietly. Some relationships faded with time, some were never fully explained, but before the end of his life, one truth remained. Only one woman truly held his heart. Before fame and recognition, before the world saw him as a symbol of quiet strength, there was a simpler life, and in that life stood Greta Kukkonen. They met when everything still felt uncertain. He was not yet a legend, just a young man trying to find his place, balancing ambition with doubt. Greta, composed and intelligent, brought stability into his world. She was not drawn to glamour, but to the man behind it. Their marriage reflected the life he thought he would live, grounded, private, and built on quiet understanding rather than attention. For a time it worked. They built a family and shared years untouched by Hollywood's pressures. But success changes the rhythm of life. As his career rose, so did the demands: long filming schedules, public attention, and a growing emotional distance. It was not sudden. It rarely is. Conversations became shorter, silences longer, and somewhere between who he was becoming and who he had been, something began to slip away. By the time the world fully embraced him, the life he once imagined had already begun to fade. Then came Ingrid Bergman. When they worked together on Spellbound, something rare took shape between them. It was not loud or dramatic, but deeply felt. It showed in their glances, lingered in their pauses. Audiences saw chemistry, but beneath it was a quiet understanding. Both carried a seriousness about their craft and knew the weight of living between public admiration and private uncertainty. Their connection was never clearly defined. No grand declarations, no headlines, only moments that felt deeper than they appeared. But life moved forward, and whatever existed between them remained unspoken, something remembered rather than lived. Not every chapter followed the same quiet rhythm. Then came Barbara Payton. Where he was measured, she was unpredictable. Where he was reserved, she was intense. Their connection was never built on stability. It existed in brief, charged moments that were difficult to explain. For a man who valued control, this contrast could feel disorienting. It was not necessarily love, but something close enough to leave a mark. Some people enter our lives not to stay, but to reveal something we do not fully understand about ourselves. It did not last, it could not, but it became another lesson, another quiet realization that not everything intense is meant to remain. Then there was Audrey Hepburn. When they met during Roman Holiday, he was already established, and she was just stepping into the spotlight. From the beginning, there was something unmistakable about her: gentleness, grace, and a quiet presence that drew people in. He saw it immediately and insisted her name receive equal prominence in the film, a rare gesture at the time. Between them was admiration and warmth, something soft and unspoken. Their connection never crossed boundaries, perhaps because both understood it belonged to a moment, not a future. Some people do not become part of our lives, yet somehow become part of who we are. As his journey continued, he encountered Ava Gardner, a woman who embodied freedom. Where he lived with discipline, she lived with passion and spontaneity. She represented a different rhythm of life, one that fascinated him but remained distant. Not every connection is meant to align. Some exist only to show us another way of being, something we may admire but never fully choose. Then, quietly, everything changed when he met Véronique Passani. She was not part of his world, no spotlight, no performance. She was thoughtful, grounded, and steady in a way that did not compete with his life, but understood it. With her, he did not have to be the man the world expected him to be. Their connection was not built on intensity or mystery, but on ease, conversation, and a quiet certainty. For the first time, there was clarity, no confusion, no distance, just something real. In the final years of his life, when everything else had softened, what remained was not fame or legacy, but love. He had known many forms of connection, each leaving its mark, but only one endured. Véronique was not just another chapter. She was where the searching ended. Their life together was built on patience, understanding, and a quiet loyalty that did not need to be proven. She was not simply beside him. She stood with him. And in the end, that was the only truth that remained. That after all the moments and all the paths, there was one person who held his heart, not for a moment, but for a lifetime. And perhaps that is what makes his story linger long after the credits have faded. The life of Gregory Peck was never just about the roles he played, no matter how iconic they became. It was about the quiet choices in between, the moments no audience ever saw, the emotions that never needed applause to be real. Because while the world remembers the man who stood tall in films like To Kill a Mockingbird, what defined him most was not a performance, but a feeling, something deeply human, often unspoken, and ultimately enduring. Love in his life was never simple. It arrived in different forms, sometimes steady, sometimes uncertain, sometimes fleeting enough to feel like a question rather than an answer. There were connections that taught him, others that challenged him, and a few that quietly reshaped the way he understood himself. But none of them, no matter how meaningful, carried the same quiet permanence as the one he found later in life. Because real love, the kind that stays, rarely announces itself. It does not compete for attention or demand to be seen. It simply remains, steady and certain, even as everything else changes. And maybe that is why his story feels so familiar. Not because it belongs to Hollywood, but because it belongs to something we all recognize. The idea that we can spend years searching through people, through moments, through versions of ourselves, only to discover that what we were looking for was never meant to be found quickly. It was meant to be understood slowly. That love is not always about intensity or timing, but about presence, about who stays when everything else moves on. In the end, Véronique Passani was not just the woman he loved. She was the answer to a question he had been living with for years. And in choosing her, quietly and without hesitation, he revealed something that no role ever could, that the most important parts of a life are not the ones the world celebrates, but the ones we choose to hold on to when the world grows quiet. And perhaps, as you sit with his story, it leaves you with a question of your own. Not about fame or legacy, but about something far more personal. In all the chapters of your life, all the people who came and went, was there someone who stayed? Or someone who almost did? Because in the end, we are not remembered for how many moments we lived, but for the ones that truly meant something, and the people who made those moments last. Because when everything else fades, the applause, the recognition, the carefully written history, what remains are the quiet truths we carry within us. For Gregory Peck, those truths were never loud. They didn't arrive with certainty in the beginning, nor did they reveal themselves all at once. They unfolded slowly, across years, through choices that at times felt unclear, and through connections that didn't always last. But each one, in its own way, led him closer to understanding what truly mattered. There is something deeply human in that journey. The idea that love is not always something we recognize immediately. That sometimes we mistake intensity for meaning, or timing for destiny. That we hold on to what feels powerful, even when it isn't meant to stay. And yet, through all of that, something within us keeps searching, not for perfection, but for peace. Not for excitement, but for understanding. And when that kind of love finally appears, it feels different. It doesn't rush. It doesn't confuse. It doesn't leave you questioning where you stand. It simply fits into your life, into your silence, into the parts of you that no one else quite reached. That was the kind of love he found with Véronique Passani. Not something that needed to be proven, but something that was quietly lived, day after day, year after year. In a world that often celebrates beginnings, the first meeting, the first spark, the first moment, His story reminds us of something far more meaningful, the importance of what endures. Because beginnings can be beautiful, but it is what lasts that defines us. The person who remains when life is no longer new, when the excitement softens into routine, when presence matters more than passion, that is the love that shapes a lifetime. And maybe that is why his story stays with us. Not because it is perfect, but because it is real. It carries the weight of choices, the quiet ache of what didn't work, and the rare comfort of finding something that finally does. It reminds us that love is not a single moment or a single person defined by time alone. It is a journey, sometimes complicated, sometimes uncertain, but always moving towards something deeper. So, as his story comes to a close, it doesn't really end. It lingers, in the same quiet way his presence once did. It leaves behind a feeling rather than a conclusion. A gentle reminder that in our own lives, through all the noise and all the searching, there may come a moment when everything becomes clear. When one person, without needing to say much at all, becomes the place where our story finally feels complete. And maybe that is the part we don't talk about enough. The waiting, the uncertainty, the years that don't seem to make sense while we are living them. For Gregory Peck, those years were not empty. They were filled with experience, with emotion, with lessons that only time could teach. Even the relationships that didn't last carried meaning. Even the moments that felt unfinished had their place. Because without them, the ending would not have held the same depth, the same quiet certainty. There is a kind of wisdom that only comes with living fully, through joy, through disappointment, through connections that change us in ways we don't immediately understand. And perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply. It reflects something universal, the idea that love is not always about getting it right the first time. Sometimes it's about growing into the kind of person who can finally recognize what right feels like. By the time he reached that place with Véronique Passani, there was no need for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. What they shared existed beyond that. It was built in the quiet spaces, in conversations that didn't need to impress, in silences that didn't feel empty, in a presence that remained steady no matter what life brought. That kind of love does not demand attention, yet it becomes the most important part of everything. And in the end, maybe that is what gives a life its true meaning. Not the number of people who pass through it, not the moments that shine the brightest, but the one connection that stays when everything else is settled. The one person who sees you not as the world sees you, but as you truly are, and chooses to remain anyway. As his story gently comes to rest, it leaves behind something more than memory. It leaves behind a question, soft but persistent. In your own life, through all the beginnings and endings, the moments that felt certain and the ones that didn't, is there someone who has quietly remained at the center of it all? Or perhaps someone you are still searching for? Because in the end, beyond the fame, beyond the time, beyond everything that eventually fades, what stays with us is simple. A feeling, a presence, a person. And sometimes, if we are fortunate enough, that one person becomes not just a part of our story, but the place where it finally feels whole. And perhaps when we sit with that truth a little longer, it begins to feel less like his story and more like something we recognize within our own lives. Because the journey of Gregory Peck was never only about the people he met, but about what those connections revealed to him over time. Each one, in its own quiet way, asked something of him: patience, understanding, honesty, even the willingness to let go when something no longer fit the life he was growing into. There is a certain stillness that comes at the end of a life well lived. Not an emptiness, but a kind of clarity. The noise fades, the questions settle, and what once felt complicated becomes simple. For him, that simplicity was not found in fame or recognition, but in the presence of one person who remained constant when everything else had changed. With Véronique Passani, there was no need to revisit the past or wonder about what might have been. What they had was enough, quietly, completely enough. And maybe that is the part of love we spend the least time preparing for. Not the beginning, not the excitement, not the uncertainty, but the staying, the choosing, again and again, without hesitation. The understanding that love is not proven in moments of intensity, but in moments of consistency. In being there, not just when it is easy, but when it is ordinary, when it is quiet, when it asks nothing more than presence. As a story fades into memory, it does not leave behind a dramatic ending or a final declaration. Instead, it leaves something softer, something that lingers in a way that is harder to define. A feeling that perhaps the most meaningful parts of our lives are not the ones the world sees, but the ones we carry quietly within us. The people who become part of our everyday existence, who shape our sense of home, who remain even when everything else moves on. And so, in the end, his story does not really end at all. It continues in the way it makes us reflect, in the questions it gently places before us. About love, about time, about the people who come into our lives, and the ones who stay. Because somewhere within all of that, there is a truth we all come to understand eventually, that a life is not measured by how much it holds, but by what it chooses to keep. And if we are fortunate, what we keep is not just a memory but a person who makes everything else feel a little more complete.